Good morning, my name is Kennedy.
Good morning. I have an interview with Doug Saunders.
Okay, just 1 second.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Doug Saunders.
Hello there. This is Hubert O'Hearn calling. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
Thank you. And thank you for agreeing to do this. The myth of the Muslim tide is such an incredibly timely and important and an excellent piece of journalism. I'm thrilled to death that you've agreed to do the interview for us.
No, it's a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure. I have to confess, I don't know your publication very well, and I mean, the book's not published in France yet. Hopefully it will be. But
Yeah.
What got the interest of a publication based in Paris?
Yeah. The Herald de Paris is seen in 197 countries in English and French, and actually the publisher is based out of Virginia.
Oh.
In the States,
What?
yeah. Yeah.
Why is it called the Herald? How does it get its name then?
It started from there, and it's essentially the spiritual heir to the old International Herald Tribune.
Yeah. I get it. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So, myth of the Muslim tide. How would you summarize the book for the audience?
What I've set out to do here is not to rail against Islamophobia or to defend Islam. In fact, I have very little interest in religions and so on. I've spent plenty of time kneeling on floors of mosques in a dozen major Islamic countries and so on. So I'm certainly familiar with the religion and its customs and so on. But I'm not particularly interested in defending it. I don't particularly like having a lot of religion around me. So I think I'm a typical secular Westerner in that I actually would be worried if there were immigrant groups that were any danger of imposing more religion on the world around me. So I don't use the word Islamophobia anywhere in this book. I don't think there's anything wrong with being afraid of Islam. A lot of my friends in Iran and Turkey and Pakistan, who I would call Muslims, secular Muslims, are afraid of Islam. So I think if Muslims can be afraid of Islam, then anyone can. I have no truck with people who are afraid of the religion. What worries me is that we've become unduly afraid of Muslims, by which I mean both religious believers in Islam and people who come from the cultures rooted in that religious belief. I think Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Salman Rushdie both call themselves secular Muslims in that they are identified as Muslims by the world, but they have no religious belief whatsoever. And that describes a lot of people in the West and so on. This is a book for them, and it's a book for people like me who are not from Islamic cultures, but who have had worries about immigration. So in a way, it's taking what we call Islamophobia in good faith. It's saying, okay, let's just assume that the people who hold this belief are not screaming racists, are not intolerant bigots, but are reasonable Western people who are afraid that the tolerant values of their society could be under threat from an immigrant. As people often said in the Netherlands during the last 10 years, we should be intolerant of the intolerant and so on. I'm quite willing to accept that as a starting point, and I'm quite willing to accept a fairly absolute belief in Enlightenment values as a starting point in a sense of absolute values that should be shared across all traditions and so on. Given that, I'm asking, what is happening with immigration to the West from Muslim-majority countries? There have been a lot of best-selling books. There have been a lot of YouTube videos and blog posts and op-ed articles in the Wall Street Journal and so on during the past 10 years, certainly since September 11th, arguing that Muslim immigrants are different from other groups, that they are somehow not like other religious minorities who've immigrated into the West, that they are three things about them. First of all, that they are not integrating, perhaps because they don't want to integrate, and are forming parallel societies based on their religious values and laws rather than on the universal values of the West. Second of all, that their population is growing at an exponential rate, that they are reproducing at rates that are vastly higher than ordinary Western populations, and that therefore they will become a plurality or majority within this century, if not the next few decades. And third of all, that Islamic extremism and violence are rooted in the beliefs of everyday Muslim believers in the West, and that there is a contiguous line of thought between the moderate religious believer and the violent extremist. So I have examined those three sets of beliefs using the best empirical information available, and I should say that the last 3 or 4 years have seen a real revolution in our understanding of the behaviors and beliefs of immigrant groups in the West, and of their demographics and the roots of extremism. So it is now possible to write a book that really provides a very empirically solid view of what's happening with immigrants from Muslim countries, and that shows that they are following the same path that Southern European Catholics and Eastern European Jews did during their time in becoming integrated into the values of the West. Not perfectly, not without troubles, but not in a way that that is a threat, or that is, shall we say, an existential threat to the society around us.
You make a very good parallel to a certain group in the late 1800s and so forth, to which I have some ancestral affinity. And I'm sure you know what I'm referring to. Would you care to speak to that comparison?
We like to think that this is different, that every time a new wave of religious minority immigrants enters the West, we think this is different from previous waves. They're from a much more alien civilization. They're from they have not so much a religion as an ideology of conquest, and they're reproducing at an impossible rate. They're going to swamp our society. This is precisely, word for word, what was said about Roman Catholics, both from Ireland and then later from Southern Europe, and what was said about Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe. And they did appear, there seemed to be evidence to support these beliefs, right? I mean, in the 1950s, when it was very popular, when there were best-selling books arguing that Catholics were a threat to the democratic values of the West, there seemed to be overwhelming evidence around to support this. Catholics were coming from countries that had all very happily fallen to fascism. They were prone to criminal extremism and acts of severe terrorism in the West. They self-segregated and sent their children to separate schools, and they were pressuring government to allow them to have their religious laws imposed upon them and so on. And it did seem overwhelmingly so. Jews from Eastern Europe were very orthodox, very cloistered, much more illiterate than average Westerners during their first generation or two, and their second generation seemed to be more religiously conservative than the first, and so on. So, you know, there were best-selling books making exactly the same arguments, and in fact, I would say that given the way that the world has progressed, that a Catholic from Italy or a Jew from Poland in 1920 would have seemed to have been, and in fact were, from a more distant civilization than a Muslim from Tehran or Riyadh is now, right? Because the southern and eastern fringes of Europe had not really absorbed the values of the Enlightenment in the early 20th century and so on, to the point that the West had. And in fact, people from those communities would very likely have had the entire rhythm of their life governed by a religious faith of a sort that simply can't exist now, even in the Islamic world. I mean, we've seen a secularizing trend throughout the Islamic world, and in fact, and a revolution in what you might call Enlightenment values, even among Islamic politics, believers in Islamic politics, and so on. I mean, the success of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is not a refutation of the secularizing trend. It's actually a response to it. It's a political response to the fact that secularism is now the defining event in family life in the Arabic world. Much as the rise of religious right-wing politics starting in the 1960s in the United States was a natural response to the fact that the country had become secularized in its family values and so on.
I'm so glad that you brought up the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. We'll get to Western politicians in a moment, but there seems to be this general sense in what I'll term lazy media, that anytime there's any sort of a political party with the word Muslim in it, people instantly see the Ayatollah Khomeini, you know?
Yeah, and look, I should be clear that I don't like the Muslim Brotherhood. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't wish them upon anybody, right? On their mild end, they could be compared to the Christian Democrats in Germany and so on.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's certainly the case with many of the members of the AKP, the Peace and Justice Party in Turkey. But that said, on their middle and conservative end, they're a very conservative party that does not believe in equal rights of women, that does not believe in equal rights for homosexuals, that does not recognize Israel, for example. And I don't think that's healthy for Egypt at all. But if we're going to step back and say, how do we deal with this party? I don't think we need to look at them as being a natural expression of the core beliefs of Egyptians. Yes, Egypt is an extremely poor and very religious society, but there's not a desire to have an Iranian-style theocracy with religious authorities running the state and writing the constitution. Now, I would also argue that in Iran there is not and has never been a majority interest in having an Islamic theocracy. It was foisted upon people against their will, and I would argue that it's never had majority support. But yes, we're having a war. As I say in the book, we're having a war. We're having a clash within civilizations far more than a clash between civilizations.
Let's knock down a few myths. And you do an exceptional job of it. One being that the birth rate of Muslims is much greater than quote unquote Christians.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the most well-established things at the moment. Is one of the most well-established sets of statistics is the population growth rate. There is no Islamic population growth rate. Poor Muslims have larger families, but they have larger families at about the same rate, and sometimes a smaller rate, than poor Christians and poor animists do in those countries. And while there are a couple of Muslim-majority countries, Afghanistan and Yemen stand out, that have vast population growth rates because of conflict and poverty and so on, what we're seeing across what we call the Islamic world, though I'm not into that concept, what we're seeing across the sweep of countries with Muslim majorities is a huge secularizing wave that is bringing down family sizes with extraordinary speed. And yes, I point to Iran as a key example because it went from having more than 7 children per family in the 1980s to having 1.7 children per family now, without having anybody particularly shouting about birth control pills and so on. And and countries with the most devout Islamic beliefs, Iran, Bangladesh, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, Lebanon, Tunisia, etc., are seeing their population growth rates fall as low as and sometimes lower than those of European countries. So first of all, in the Muslim world, but second of all, immigrants, as they always do, converge with the population growth rates of the country around them. It doesn't happen instantly. It takes 3 generations usually, but it is happening. The idea of Muslims becoming a majority in any European country is a fallacy. It's statistically impossible. Even if very high immigration rates stayed in place. By the middle of this century, Muslim population growth, family sizes and fertility rates in Europe will have converged with those of the general population, if not before. And at its peak, the Muslim population of Europe, including Russia, could possibly just brush 10%, at which point it would peak. But that's also assuming that no other major immigrant groups are coming in. And there are much larger immigrant groups than Muslims in almost all European countries. I mean, Spain, which is right next to the Arab world, only 16% of immigrants are Muslim. And it gets lower as you move further away. So we need to get rid of this idea that they are going to become a majority, aside from the fact that the child of a religious Muslim is not by any means a religious Muslim, and so on. You know, I think if we were to go back in time and spend a few weeks in the culture of our own grandparents or great-grandparents, we would be visiting a culture that is as alien from us today as a visit to Riyadh would be to us geographically. So we also have to keep in mind that cultural change is happening fast. And if there's a core message in the facts that I've assembled in this book, it's one of change. It's one that we cannot talk about one civilization moving into another civilization because there is both extremely rapid change within Islamic countries. I mean, they are seeing the fastest reduction in population growth rates in the world. And also, within the immigrant communities, there is among the fastest rates of change that you'll see anywhere. The difference between an immigrant from Pakistan in Canada and the Canadian-born child of an immigrant from Pakistan is so vast in any measurable quantity, in any cultural or economic or educational standard, that you're basically not talking about the same civilization or culture at all, and so on. I mean, for us to go from our great-grandparents' values regarding women and homosexuals and equal rights and secular institutions to our own was a huge transformation that took huge battles and is still incomplete, I should add, and took 3 or 4 generations in the West. We're seeing that transformation happen in 1 and at most 2 generations among offspring of immigrants. So rather than being alarmed at the pockets of failed integration, which certainly do exist and are a cause for concern, we should be amazed at the extraordinary rate at which adoption of Western values is happening among these immigrants.
I want to pull a quote from the former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Newt Gingrich, where Gingrich said that stealth jihadis use political, cultural, societal, religious, intellectual tools. Violent jihadis use violence, but in fact they're both engaged in jihad and they're both seeking to impose the same end state, which is to replace Western civilization with the radical imposition of Sharia. Why do you think, it's one thing to say, Newt Gingrich is an idiot. You don't have to say that. I said it for us. But these are, and Gingrich is just one. Very senior elected officials who, put bluntly, ought to know better. Why do they say these things?
A set of ideas about Muslims that had been on the extreme fringes of politics 15 years ago, in the years since September 11th, have infiltrated their way into very mainstream politics, really, because it's not just Newt Gingrich saying these things. It was at least 4 or 5 of the candidates for Republican leadership, though not Mitt Romney. It has been mainstream politicians and leaders of political parties in a dozen European countries. In the United States, it's been the heads of the New York Police Department, senior officials in the FBI, and so on, who have all been repeating what I'm calling the Muslim tide hypothesis as a common sense thing. And one of the things I do in this book is I trace how that came to become acceptable in mainstream politics, a set of ideas about religious minorities that had disappeared for 2 generations. And one of the things that happened was that there was a power vacuum on the right in the years after September 11th, which allowed the increasingly well-funded set of activist groups on the anti-Muslim right to stroll into, particularly the U.S. Republican Party, but I would say also some of the Dutch parties, some parties in both left and right in Germany, Northern European parties, and so on, and establish themselves as mainstream voices, right? So, I mean, this summer has been extraordinary in that we could have a moment when 5 members of the House of Representatives could issue a serious proclamation declaring that 2 of the most senior officials of Muslim background in U.S. government and politics are in fact agents of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, and so on, with surprisingly little outrage from mainstream conservative circles. Yes, I mean, they were denounced as fringe, but then we had a bunch of other people pop up supporting them and so on. Newt Gingrich supported them. These aren't people on the extreme fringe. And much as with the anti-Catholic movements of the 1940s and 1950s, it's a group within Congress who are well accepted. And I would argue that it's partly because this has gone unquestioned. It's partly because, and why do people vote for these people? Well, I'm actually willing to give them some sympathy, the voters. I don't think that there is actually the kind of mass racism or delusionalism in North American society and Western European society that would suggest that voting. I don't think people voting for anti-Muslim parties are extreme racists. I think there's a reasonable misunderstanding that has happened because most immigrants from Muslim countries, certainly in Canada and the United States and in most European countries, are people who have arrived since 1990 and their children. They're a very new group. They're a very visible group. They wear the hijab sometimes. Their neighborhoods have minarets rather than crosses. And their arrival has unhappily coincided with a political extremist movement, Islamic extremism, that has caused a lot of death and mayhem around the world and to some extent in the West. And it's quite reasonable for people to wonder if these 2 things are connected and so on. I mean, people in the know can show that they're not, that this political movement is not related to the immigration and so on, that it's a separate thing. But you do need to show that, and it's quite reasonable to assume that. I certainly have had moments when I have worried about my, shalwar kameez wearing neighbors while there are bombing attacks going on in London, where the guy with the beard across from me on the bus, I've spent the entire bus journey staring at his backpack and wondering if my neighbors from Muslim backgrounds are really supporting the core values of the West. And if I can feel that way as somebody who's spent a lot of time within Muslim majority countries examining the politics and so on, if I can fear my neighbors, then I think anyone can, and that it's a reasonable leap of faith. It's a reasonable leap of logic to assume that they're a threat. We need to step back and apply some proper empirical scientific principles to try and determine whether that is true. Well, I've done that. It's not especially true. There are real worries, but one of them is not. First of all, there is not a political ideology of conquest hiding behind the everyday Islam of the people around us from Muslim countries. And second of all, the more mild idea that Muslims are a different group of immigrants in that they will not or cannot integrate also is delusional. They are integrating at the same rate as other religious minorities have. So both the radical version in which they're a fifth column and the moderate version in which they're simply unintegratable can be proven to be based on delusional ideas, but very popular ones.
The last question, Doug, and you must have given this some thought, that all religions, whether it's worshiping Jesus or Muhammad or Buddha or Haile Selassie or whomever or whatever, they all preach a message of peace and tolerance and so forth. What is it that then gets turned around into hate and intolerance? What is it about it?
Well, I'm not entirely willing to take religions at their word that they are religions of peace and tolerance and so on.
There's a lot of evidence, yeah.
most religions were born not out of a desire of peace, but out of wars with other religions, and so on, or out of a perhaps understandable response to persecution. And am I a bit of an anti-religious bigot? Well, in a certain respect, yes. Perhaps I've seen too much, and I'm a bit crassly intolerant. I mean, I have a lot of time for Richard Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens and so on, and their beliefs about religion, and I often do have to apologize to my friends who are religious believers, whether they're Christian or Jewish or Muslim, because of my beliefs. Because look, as a non-religious secularist, I do have to acknowledge that there are plenty of people with strong religious beliefs who are extremely moral people who do good things in the world. So, and that some of the worst crimes of history have been committed by non-religious movements and so on. So I can't be too loud and proud about that. On the other hand, I'm a strong believer in secularism as a way to solve the problem of having religious believers around us. And most Western societies since the Enlightenment have faced the core question of how to have conflicting groups of people living together whose religious beliefs may be incompatible with one another, who are guided by beliefs and laws that seem contradictory to one another. And we have so far managed quite well, I think, actually, in having a type of pluralism that allows for different beliefs around a core set of values that should be shared by generally everyone. And I mean, my earnest question, because look, there's a big debate in Europe about whether Islamic immigration was a threat to the core values of the Enlightenment, and that pitted some of the leading philosophers of Europe and the United States against each other during the 2000s, and I think the answer to that question is not to dismiss the idea of fundamental Enlightenment values and threats to fundamental Enlightenment values, but is to look at the people who are coming in not as fixed points in time and fixed points in belief, but as people going through a transition, as families going through a transition and going through change and so on. And I think the way we came to those values of pluralism and human rights and equality was a process that we went through, that these immigrants are going through as well. If we're going to have new people in our society, and I think it will happen, I'm not arguing for or against immigration, but I'm just simply saying that it will happen. then we shouldn't be saying, are they a threat? We should be saying, how are they becoming not a threat? How are people from somewhat intolerant religious backgrounds fitting in? Are their children remaining as intolerant as the parents? Are they self-ghettoizing and so on? And that's what I'm examining here. And I do leave readers with a set of challenges that we do have to deal with the rise of the word Islam as a source of self-identity and pride, with the problems of political modernization in Muslim countries, and even with the problems with the word multiculturalism. I mean, I think for many of us in the West, the word multiculturalism sounds like a benign tolerance of people from different traditions around a core set of beliefs. But for a lot of immigrants, it almost seems like forcing them into a sort of cultural relativism that they didn't want when they entered the West and so on.
Right.
And that maybe we should stop talking about both multiculturalism and about the idea of a fixed and immutable core culture, and instead allowing culture to be an effect rather than a cause, to allowing culture to be something that people develop and change out of their affinities, rather than as a fixed entity that's imposed upon people, either from their own families and communities or from outside within the nation into which they've immigrated.
Fantastic, and you're absolutely right. You know that there's no such thing as any culture that has ever been frozen in time and didn't change at all from generation to.
Yeah, usually when you get people trying to legislate that, it's a sign that culture no longer really exists as a living thing.
Oh, well said. Well said. And I think we'll end there. Doug, again, thanks a million for doing this. It's a massively important book, and I hope that it sells well and it is well discussed too. Have a fantastic day.
A real pleasure to talk with you. Thank you very much. I hope we get the chance again.
That'll be my pleasure too.
Great. Thank you very much.
Bye now.
All right.